It's July the 15th, 1410, and the 26th Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, a man named Ulrich von Jungingen, is terrified. He's surrounded by opposing enemy forces that, if they defeat him, will bring about the demise of his kingdom, shuttering him and his legacy to a footnote in the history books, relegated to a tiny speck that would slowly be forgotten as the future unfolds. But Ulrich wants to go to the past, not the future, because just 30 seconds beforehand, he would have been practically giddy, about to completely encircle his enemy, bringing forth the chance to defeat two major powers and expand into their territory. It would have cemented him as a great leader, a conqueror, and a faithful man who answers God's wishes. Now, he was staring down cavalry all around him as bows and arrows pepper his men from every side. They're falling left and right. The initial taste of sweet victory is starting to taste awfully sour. It's a lot to go through in such a short time, and one can only imagine the horrors appearing in his mind at the moment he recognised all was lost. But this was no surprise encounter. It had been coordinated and planned for months. The tactical setup was perfect. So, what happened? How could all of this have gone so wrong? This is a story about territorial ambitions and overstaying your welcome. It's a story of spilled blood and men dying young. But it's also a story of fraternity and about leaving nobody behind. It's one that would change history in Eastern Europe forever. This is the tale of the Great Battle of Grunwald, and the great nation of Poland might not exist today without it. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Incogni, the ultimate tool to take your personal data off the market. Your personal data is being collected, bought and sold every single day, often without your knowledge or consent. Data brokers compile detailed profiles on you, your name, your address, your shopping habits, even your online activity, and then they sell that information to advertisers, insurers, sometimes worse. Incogni is a service designed to fight back. It works on your behalf to contact these data brokers and demand the removal of your personal information. It's fast and completely automated, saving you hours of time that you would have spent chasing these brokers one by one, and instead it simply gives you back control over your privacy. Right now, you can get 60% off an annual plan when you use my link and enter the code FLASHBACK at checkout. Creepy data brokers and their allies have built a system to watch you. Incogni is how you disappear. Although the story ends with a bloodbath on the plains of 15th century Poland, you might be surprised to learn that our story begins long, long ago in a kingdom far, far away. 300 years ago, in fact, all the way back in the Holy Land. In the year of 1190 AD, in Jerusalem, a new holy order of knights had just been founded, called the Hospitallers of St. Mary of the Teutons, but we know them today by their more common name, the Teutonic Order, or simply the Teutons. Although created for a divine purpose, the Teutons wouldn't actually spend much time in the Holy Land because they weren't just men-at-arms, they were Christian crusaders, the Lord Almighty's faithful warriors prepared to vanquish ungodly religions across the land, as well as the heretics who occupy them. The order took a special interest in Eastern Europe. The Lithuanians at the time were pagans, and there were no shortage of volunteers looking to find divine retribution in glorious conquest. So, in the 1230s, the order would venture out towards Lithuania, backed by the support of the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States. Their divine task? To conquer Prussia east of the River Vistula in modern-day Poland, and to convert its pagan population to Christianity. And for over a century, that's exactly what they did. They raided Prussia and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, causing as much havoc as possible, sacking cities, pillaging towns, capturing prisoners, converting locals, taxing peasants, and looting whatever they could find. Fast forward to the early 15th century, and they were still there, having conquered quite a lot of land in that time. The Knights' territory stretched all the way from modern-day Kaliningrad and northern Poland in the south, all the way up to the Baltic coast and the frigid Gulf of Finland. Of course, all of this was about as popular as you might imagine with the locals, and it deeply displeased both the Poles and Lithuanians, who were closely allied during this time. They would only be a century and a half from establishing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so it's safe to say relations between the Poles and Lithuanians were pretty good, and they had a common enemy to bond over: the Teutonic Order. You see, technically speaking, the Teutons had no good reason to still be in Eastern Europe. The Poles were already Catholic at the time, and in 1383, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, a man by the name of Vytautas, had been officially baptized. Lithuania would effectively convert after Vytautas's cousin, Jogaila, married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, who was Christian herself. This would be just part of a long shared history in which the two entities would formally merge over a century later, but it also meant that the Teutonic Knights were on a crusade with no real target. There was nobody left to convert. In a sense, the Teutons were suffering from their own success. It should have been mission accomplished. Time for the boys to pack up and find another crusade elsewhere. But all of a sudden, the Teutons were refusing to leave now that they had territory of their own in the region. The Teutons felt that they had earned this land through righteous conquest. But the Poles and Lithuanians felt that these crusaders had no reason to cause problems in Christian lands, and they'd long outstayed their purpose and, quite frankly, their welcome. War seemed inevitable, and to make matters worse, the region had been relatively unstable for quite a while by this point. Back in the early 1380s, Lithuania fought a civil war for 3 years. It's not super important why in relation to this story, just know that as a result of that civil war, a Lithuanian lowland region named Samogitia was ceded to the Teutonic Order and formed the heart of the Teutons' current territory. But the Samogitians resented being ruled by the Teutons. These noble Teutonic knights and their various allies originating from faraway lands couldn't know what was best for the people of the local area, especially given their track record of running amok over a century long. Eventually, everyday Lithuanian farmers, peasants and merchants couldn't take it. So they rose up in the streets against their new masters, and conflict would continue all the way until 1409. The Samogitians sent letters to royal courts all over Europe, begging for anyone to come and free them from the Teutonic menace. But many were hesitant to help. The Teutonic Order had the backing of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. It was like a bully that you didn't want to fight because their parents were on the scoreboard. But on the sidelines, the Polish-Lithuanian Union was keeping a close eye, ready to choose the right moment to strike, because as soon as they started making moves, the Teutons would respond. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas, would eventually send aid to the Samogitians to assist them in their uprising. But some of this aid was actually captured by the Teutons, and their leader, Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, threatened to invade Lithuania. As a result, Brother Poland was having none of it. And that's because the Polish-Lithuanian Union at this point's pretty large, spanning most of the geographic area we would refer to today as Eastern Europe. It hosted territory all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. At its peak, it would spread from the outskirts of Moscow well into Central Europe. And what comes with a lot of land? A lot of men. And a lot of gold to pay them with. So the Polish, led by their king Władysław II Jagiełło, stated that Poland would defend Lithuania in the event of conflict and even threatened to invade Teutonic lands. Undeterred, Ulrich would declare war on both regions in 1409. He figured that if he could defeat both powers, he would cement Teutonic rule in the Baltics for many decades to come. He hoped to destroy both armies separately, and his military launched into Polish lands first, catching the Poles by surprise and requiring a frantic defence. And although the invasion was relatively small, the campaign began really promisingly, with some early wins for the Teutons, such as the burning of the castle at Dobrin and the capture of nearby settlements. The Holy Roman Empire tried to broker a peace, but by this stage no one was having it. all-out war had become inevitable. Poland and Lithuania started to amass huge numbers of forces in response to the large battle that would soon decide the fate of Eastern Europe. The Teutons would recruit heavily as well, paying for mercenary support from the Holy Roman Empire by bringing the ruler of Hungary and future Holy Roman Emperor King Sigismund to invade the region of Moldavia, a land to which he laid claim but at the time was held by the Poles. But Union didn't expect the sheer number of troops that the Poles and Lithuanians were amassing. The number just kept growing and growing and growing. Many came from within their own massive borders, but they also purchased mercenaries from Bohemia and Moravia. And remember Moldavia, which was under Polish rule at the time, but being invaded by Hungary? Well, troops from there arrived too, alongside a large contingent of Tatar forces. All of this meant that the Teutons were outnumbered. Different sources claim different sizes for the forces. Some say that both sides had close to 10,000 men, whilst others go as high as 40,000 on each side. But what we do know is that the Polish-Lithuanian forces did outnumber the Teutonic Knights by a ratio of roughly 3-2. That's not an overwhelming advantage for a medieval battlefield, but in one decisive battle, it certainly could be. And now, all of these men were marching right towards Teutonic territory. What made it worse for Union is that he made something of a tactical mistake here. The Teutons expected the Polish and Lithuanians, both proud, patriotic peoples in their own right, to have separate forces and therefore separate invasions. Union planned to deal with each individually, which would allow his more professional army to have the advantage over two smaller foes. But when the two converged, he realised he'd already lost the initiative. Because of the size of the combined force, Union realised that he could no longer be on the front foot, and so the Teutons needed to take up a defensive formation near their capital of Marienburg, responding to the larger force and finding opportunities to strike based on what the Polish-Lithuanians did. Their plan, for what it was worth, was pretty simple. They were going straight for Marienburg too. Cut off the head of the snake, and so the body dies. The forces would eventually meet in an empty field near Marienburg between the villages of Tannenberg, Ludwigsdorf and Grunwald, where this battle would eventually be named after. It was July 15th, a hot summer day, as horses, carts, cannons, archers, crossbowmen, infantry and other warriors marched towards one another. The left offensive flank consisted of Polish heavy cavalry and the right of Lithuanian light cavalry. The centre of three columns consisted of foot soldiers and other warriors gathered from across the landscape. Tatar skirmishers rode their horses close to the front, bows drawn. Crossbowmen stood cocked and ready to fire. The horses were getting restless as the cannons were rolled into view. Władysław, King of Poland, would be in the centre with his own security forces. The Teutons put their heavy cavalry on their left flank, therefore directly opposite of the Lithuanian light cavalry. These cavalry troops were believed to be some of the Teutonic Knights themselves, owing to their elite experience and the discipline that was recorded in the battle. On the right flank was weaker cavalry and some infantry to support them. Behind both flanks were several groups of archers and cannons pointed squarely at the Polish-Lithuanian forces. Ulrich von Jungen was likely roughly in the centre near the back, commanding the forces of this false crusade. Both groups would inch towards one another and then stop, as if assessing their adversaries' capabilities. And then, with an almighty explosion, the Teutonic cannons were brought forward and launched. Heavy metal balls peppered the battleground, but fell short, causing no actual damage. And then rain would come, ending the short bombardment before it had really began. Seeing this as a sign to attack, the Lithuanian right flank's light cavalry moved in to engage the enemy. As the two sides crashed into each other, a whirlwind of blood, metal and flesh would commence. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained through the sky on all sides. Infantry were cut down by heavy cavalry. Riders and horses alike were peppered with indirect fire or slashed at with swords. Soldiers were stabbed, shot, trampled, and beaten as fierce fighting condemned many to a muddy grave. But the Lithuanian right flank was wavering. The Teutons were knights, after all, displaying skill and fearlessness in battle. Soon enough, the Teutonic cavalry pushed the Lithuanians back into a full-blown pursuit, where they soon broke and fled. This was a disaster for the Polish-Lithuanian forces, as their right flank was now completely exposed. Once this weakness was reorganized, the Teutonic Order could simply slam down with their reserve forces, flanking the entire army and rolling up the line into a total rout. That would mean sure defeat. Upon seeing this, the Polish heavy cavalry suffered a morale blow and also decided to fall back, fearing the worst was yet to come. And it was in this moment where the fate of Europe stood on a knife's edge. Poland needed a hero. And then they got one. The Order of Smolensk, a knight's troop from a city in what today is Russian territory, but at the time was a Lithuanian contingent, charged in out of nowhere to plug the gap on the right side. They were able to fight off the Teutonic advance and potential flanking maneuver. This one move saved at least half of the army from total slaughter, and without it, the Poles and their additional mercenaries would have been left to fight all alone. The two sides slogged it out over the ensuing hours, battling tooth and nail, doing whatever it took to get the other to break and run. But neither side would accept defeat as the bodies continued to fall. To indicate just how close this battle was, take the Krakow banner for example. It was considered one of the most important in Poland, and to lose it to an enemy would be humiliating and demoralizing. The banner was indeed captured by the Teutons, and then the Poles would go on to recapture it later during a counterattack. Both sides were just neck and neck. But the Teutons were still showing their worth with their battle-scarred knights who were used to these kinds of long and brutal thugging matches. Jungingen chose the right moment to commit his reserves as he himself led the charge, hoping to strike into the flank so deeply that he could kill the Polish king and win the battle. His forces swung around the weakened Polish right flank, almost completely surrounding the warriors still fighting there. Once they dealt with them, they could simply wrap up the whole line and call it a day. The Polish flank was crumbling quickly. Victory looked assured for the Teutons. The Poles didn't need a hero now. They needed a full-blown miracle. But, unbeknownst to those thumping it out in the mud, behind the scenes, the light cavalry of the Lithuanians that had previously been routed had suddenly rallied, and now they were charging right for the flanking Teutons. They smashed into the rear, causing panic and confusion, and it was now the Teutonic Knights who were suddenly surrounded. Jungingen was trapped in the melee, bravely battling on after receiving wounds to his chest and face, but he could not turn the tide, and soon a knight on horseback thrust a lance straight through his neck, killing him instantly. The word spread quickly that their leader and best troops had been cut down, and the Teutons started to break. Many turned and fled, whilst others stood and fought as they were cut down, determined to meet a warrior's death. Some of the Teutons fled to nearby areas where they would be found and either taken prisoner or killed. Meanwhile, others retreated to the village of Grunwald, where they organised a defence of wagons tied with chains. This defence, however, did not last long. Outnumbered and with morale at an all-time low, the majority of forces who fled to Grunwald were then chased down and killed by the Polish-Lithuanian forces. It has since been reported that the village people of Grunwald actually joined in with the killing. The few Teutons that had actually managed to rush back to Marienburg in time did eventually go on to hold the city, but many Prussian castles that the Teutons owned were surrendered to the Poles and Lithuanians. They were eventually able to sue for peace in 1411, in which the Teutonic Order was made to pay a substantial cash sum, as well as give up the entirety of Samogitia back to the Lithuanians. It was a humiliating defeat in the end for a force that had been ubiquitous in the Baltics for over 2 centuries. And all of this marked the beginning of the decline of the Teutonic Order. But on the flip side, Grunwald set in motion the continual rise of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The Battle of Grunwald itself would rightfully be regarded as one of the most important fights in all of Polish history, as without them having snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, the makeup of Europe could have evolved very differently and led to a totally different continent to the one that we know today. It was a nasty, ugly victory. But if you asked the soon-to-be Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they'd do it all again to protect their brothers in arms.